What if the greatest enemy of God's chosen nation was not a foreign empire, but themselves? What if the tribes that once stood shoulder to shoulder under David and Solomon eventually turned their swords against their own brothers? The story of Israel and Judah is one of the most shocking chapters in biblical history. A kingdom blessed by God, united in power, wealth, and faith, suddenly torn apart by pride, political mistakes, spiritual compromise, and broken leadership. What began as the golden age of Israel slowly descended into division, rebellion, and civil war that would last for centuries. In this video, we will uncover the hidden causes behind this tragic conflict and explore why the tribes of God fought each other instead of standing united. If you enjoy biblical history explained clearly, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and let's explore this incredible story together. Before the kingdom was torn apart, before brother turned against brother, there was a time when the tribes of Israel stood united as one nation under God. It was a golden age. The 12 tribes that had once wandered through the wilderness had finally become a powerful kingdom. Under King David, Israel rose from a fragile collection of tribes into a unified nation that commanded respect across the region. David captured the city of Jerusalem and established it as the capital, a city that would soon become the spiritual and political center of God's people. The Bible records the strength of David's kingdom in 2 Samuel 8, describing how the king defeated surrounding enemies and secured Israel's borders. For the first time in generations, the tribes were not fighting each other or struggling for survival. They were united, protected, and blessed. When David's son Solomon took the throne, the kingdom entered a period of even greater prosperity. Solomon was famous for his wisdom, wealth, and ambitious vision for Israel's future. People from distant lands came to hear his teachings and witness the splendor of his kingdom. 1 Kings 4:29-30 tells us, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East. Under Solomon's leadership, Israel became one of the most powerful and prosperous nations of its time. His greatest achievement was the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Built with materials gathered from across the region and crafted by thousands of workers, the Temple became the heart of Israel's worship. It was the place where the people believed God's presence dwelled among them. But that magnificent temple did not come easily. The kingdom's glory required enormous resources. Massive construction projects spread across the land. Cities were fortified. Palaces were built. Administrative centers rose across Israel. To support these projects, Solomon created a system that placed heavy demands on the people. 1 Kings 5:13 records the scale of this system. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. These were not volunteers. Fathers were taken from their homes. Sons left their fields. Families were separated for months at a time as workers were sent north to cut timber or labor on royal construction projects. The Bible also tells us in 1 Kings 5:15 that Solomon employed 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills. That meant nearly 200,000 men were involved in building projects throughout the kingdom. Imagine the scene. Villages watching their strongest men march away. Wives waiting months for their husbands to return. Children growing up with fathers who were rarely home. At first, the people tolerated the burden because the kingdom was strong and prosperous. But slowly, quietly, resentment began to grow. And the burden was not shared equally. Many of the northern tribes felt they carried the heaviest load, while Judah, the king's own tribe, seemed to receive special treatment. On the surface, Israel looked stronger than ever. But beneath the prosperity, the first cracks in the kingdom had already begun to form. And those cracks would soon split the nation in two. But the troubles that would eventually tear the kingdom apart did not begin with taxes or forced labor. They began in the heart of the king himself, the man who had once asked God for wisdom. The man who built the temple in Jerusalem slowly began making choices that would undermine everything his father David had established. The Bible reveals the turning point in 1 Kings chapter 11. It begins with a simple but devastating statement. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. 1 Kings 11:1. These marriages were not simply personal relationships. In the ancient world, they were political alliances meant to secure peace with neighboring nations. Every royal marriage strengthened diplomatic ties and expanded Solomon's influence across the region. But these alliances came with a spiritual cost. God had given Israel a clear command generations earlier. The people were not to intermarry with nations that worshipped other gods. The reason was simple and direct. They will surely turn your hearts after their gods. 1 Kings 11:2. At first, Solomon may have believed he could maintain control over these alliances. After all, he was the wisest man in the world. But wisdom cannot protect a heart that slowly drifts away from obedience. The Bible tells us just how far this situation went. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. 1 Kings 11:3. 1,000 foreign women living within the royal court meant 1,000 foreign influences entering the spiritual life of the kingdom. And over time, those influences began to reshape the king himself. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. 1 Kings 11:4. Imagine the scene. The same king who had dedicated the temple to the Lord now allowed other gods to be worshipped within sight of Jerusalem. The Bible describes what happened next in shocking detail. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. 1 Kings 11:7. These were not harmless cultural traditions. Chemosh and Molech were associated with some of the darkest religious practices in the ancient world. Worship often included violent rituals and even the sacrifice of children. And now, altars to these gods were rising in the land that had been chosen to worship the one true God. The smoke of sacrifices to pagan gods began to rise from the hills surrounding Jerusalem, mixing with the smoke from the temple itself. The kingdom that was meant to be a light to the nations was beginning to resemble the very nations God had commanded Israel to avoid. Solomon's political success had reached its peak, but spiritually, the kingdom was already beginning to fall. And God was watching. As Solomon's reign continued, the kingdom still looked powerful from the outside. The temple stood in Jerusalem. Trade continued to flow through Israel's cities. Foreign nations still respected the king whose wisdom had once amazed the world. But beneath the appearance of stability, something had already changed. The spiritual decline of the king had consequences that could no longer be ignored. The nation that had once been devoted to God was now filled with altars to foreign gods, and the leadership that was meant to guide the people had begun to drift away from the covenant that defined Israel's identity. God's patience was reaching its limit. And when God moves in judgment, he often sends a warning first. That warning came through a prophet named Ahijah from Shiloh, and the man he approached was someone few people would have expected to become a king. His name was Jeroboam. Jeroboam was not part of the royal family. He was a capable and hard-working leader who had risen through the ranks of Solomon's administration. The Bible describes him as a man of ability, someone the king trusted enough to oversee the labor forces of several northern tribes. This meant Jeroboam saw something that Solomon himself no longer saw. He witnessed the growing frustration among the people. Day after day, he watched men leave their homes to join labor crews. He heard complaints from families who were struggling under the weight of taxes and forced work. The northern tribes, especially Ephraim and Manasseh, were carrying much of the burden that supported the royal projects in Jerusalem. Jeroboam understood the tension that was quietly spreading across the kingdom. But God had a much larger plan unfolding. One day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah met him on the road. The two men found themselves alone in the countryside. What happened next was strange, dramatic, and impossible to misunderstand. Ahijah took the new cloak he was wearing and suddenly tore it into 12 pieces. In ancient prophetic tradition, actions like this were never random. They were visual messages meant to reveal what God was about to do. The prophet then handed 10 pieces of the torn cloak to Jeroboam. The meaning was shocking. God was about to tear the kingdom apart. 10 tribes would be taken away from the house of Solomon and given to Jeroboam. Only a small portion of the kingdom would remain under David's dynasty, preserved because of the promise God had made to David and the city of Jerusalem. This was not merely political change. It was divine judgment. Solomon's kingdom had reached a level of glory that few nations in history had ever experienced. But the spiritual compromise that had taken root within the palace had now begun to threaten the entire nation. The unity of Israel was about to be shattered. And the man holding 10 torn pieces of cloth in his hands had just learned that he would stand at the center of that coming division. Years passed after the prophecy was spoken, and the kingdom continued under Solomon's rule. The temple still stood in Jerusalem. The cities Solomon had built continued to function. From the outside, the kingdom still looked stable. But beneath the surface, the tensions that had formed during Solomon's reign never disappeared. Then, after 40 years on the throne, Solomon died. The crown now passed to his son, Rehoboam. At that moment, the future of the kingdom stood at a crossroads. In earlier generations, a new king from David's family would have taken the throne without question. But things were different now. The tribes had endured decades of heavy taxes and forced labor, and they were no longer willing to accept the same conditions without protest. Instead of automatically crowning Rehoboam in Jerusalem, the leaders of Israel gathered in the city of Shechem. This location carried deep historical meaning. It was a place connected to the early history of Israel, a place where covenants had once been renewed between the people and God. Now the tribes gathered there again, but this time their purpose was different. They wanted answers. When Rehoboam arrived, he was met by representatives from across the kingdom. Standing among them was Jeroboam, who had recently returned from Egypt after years of exile. The man who had once fled Solomon was now speaking on behalf of the northern tribes. Their message was direct and surprisingly reasonable. They said the burden placed on them during Solomon's reign had been too heavy. The forced labor, the taxation, and the constant demands of royal building projects had pushed the people to their limits. But they were not asking for rebellion. They made the new king a simple offer: lighten the burden, treat the people with fairness, and they would remain loyal. For Rehoboam, this was the most important decision of his life. The young king asked for 3 days to consider the request. During that time, he consulted 2 groups of advisors. First, he spoke with the older counselors who had served his father Solomon. These men had watched the kingdom grow, and they understood the mood of the people. Their advice was clear. Show humility, speak kindly to the people, and they will remain your servants forever. But Rehoboam was not satisfied. He then turned to the younger men who had grown up with him in the royal court. Unlike the older advisors, these men had never experienced the hardships faced by ordinary Israelites. They had lived their entire lives surrounded by privilege and power. Their advice was very different. Instead of showing compassion, they urged the king to show strength. They told him to answer the people with harshness and authority, to make it clear that his rule would be even stronger than his father's. 3 days later, the tribes gathered again, waiting to hear the king's decision. Rehoboam stepped forward and delivered the answer that would change Israel's history. Instead of easing the burden, he declared that he would make it even heavier. In that moment, the fragile unity of the kingdom shattered. With Rehoboam's harsh decision, the kingdom was officially divided. 10 tribes in the north rejected the rule of David's dynasty and chose Jeroboam as their king. Only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam in the south. What had once been a single nation was now 2 separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom would be known as Israel. The southern kingdom would be called Judah. For the first time since the days of David, God's people were no longer united. But Jeroboam quickly realized that becoming king was only the beginning of his challenge. Politically, he now ruled the majority of the tribes. His kingdom had more territory, more people, and important cities throughout the north. But there was one problem he could not ignore. The temple of the Lord was still in Jerusalem, which now belonged to the rival kingdom of Judah. According to the law given through Moses, every Israelite man was expected to travel to Jerusalem during the major religious festivals. Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles all required worship at the temple. This created a serious danger for Jeroboam. If his people continued traveling south to worship, they would be entering the territory of their political enemy several times every year. Over time, they might begin to feel connected again to Jerusalem, to the temple, and to the royal family of David. Jeroboam feared that loyalty to the southern kingdom might slowly return. If that happened, the people might turn against him. The Bible describes his concern in 1 Kings 12:26-27, where Jeroboam begins to reason within himself that the kingdom could return to the house of David if the people continued worshiping in Jerusalem. Instead of trusting that God would secure his throne, Jeroboam made a decision that would shape the future of the northern kingdom. He created a new system of worship. 2 golden calves were made and placed in Bethel in the south of his kingdom and Dan in the north. These locations were carefully chosen so that people from every part of Israel could worship without traveling to Jerusalem. Jeroboam then told the people something deeply troubling. He presented these idols as representations of the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt. It sounded familiar. It sounded convenient. And for many people, it seemed like a practical solution. But it was a dangerous compromise. Jeroboam also appointed his own priests, ignoring the traditional priesthood that had descended from the tribe of Levi. New shrines were built, new festivals were organized, and a completely separate religious structure began to develop in the northern kingdom. What began as a political strategy had now become a spiritual crisis. The division between Israel and Judah was no longer just about leadership or taxation. It had become a division of worship, belief, and identity. And that division would grow deeper with every passing generation. Once the kingdom was divided, peace between the two nations quickly became impossible. What had once been a family of tribes living under one king was now two rival kingdoms watching each other with suspicion. Israel in the north and Judah in the south shared the same ancestors, the same history, and the same covenant with God. But politically, they had become enemies. The Bible describes the situation in simple but sobering words. There was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. The division that began with harsh words at Shechem soon turned into years of conflict. Border towns became dangerous places to live. Farmers working near the frontier never knew when soldiers might march through their fields. Trade routes that once connected the tribes now became guarded boundaries between rival states. Families were divided as well. Relatives who once traveled freely between the territories suddenly found themselves separated by politics and war. A man might have cousins in Judah and brothers living in Israel, yet the two kingdoms were now locked in constant rivalry. The tragedy was that neither kingdom could fully accept the situation. Rehoboam believed the northern tribes had rebelled against the rightful dynasty of David. From his perspective, Israel was not a separate nation, but a breakaway territory that should be brought back under his control. Jeroboam, on the other hand, knew that if Judah ever regained authority, his throne would disappear. For him, independence had to be defended at all costs. This mutual fear kept the conflict alive. Each kingdom began strengthening its military forces. Fortified cities appeared along the borders. Armies were raised, trained, and prepared for battle. Instead of building a stronger nation together, both kingdoms spent their resources preparing to fight each other. The situation grew even more complicated as foreign powers became involved. Kings from both Israel and Judah occasionally formed alliances with neighboring nations, hoping to gain an advantage over their rival. These political deals often brought new dangers, pulling the divided kingdom into wider regional conflicts. While the two nations focused on each other, larger empires were quietly growing in power beyond their borders. Egypt, Aram, Assyria, and later Babylon were watching the region closely. A united Israel under David and Solomon had once been strong enough to command respect from these powers. But now the divided kingdoms were weaker, smaller, and easier to manipulate. The civil conflict between Israel and Judah slowly drained their strength. Instead of standing together as God's chosen people, they had become rivals, competing for survival. And every year that the division continued, the consequences grew more severe. What began as a disagreement between tribes had now become a permanent fracture in the nation. A fracture that would eventually leave both kingdoms vulnerable to the rising empires of the ancient world. As the years passed, the northern kingdom of Israel began to stabilize politically. Despite the early turmoil following the split, a series of kings strengthened the nation's military and economic position. Cities were expanded, trade routes reopened, and new centers of power developed throughout the region. Eventually, a powerful leader named Omri rose to the throne. Omri understood that a strong kingdom needed a secure capital, so he established a new royal city called Samaria. Built on a high hill and surrounded by natural defenses, Samaria quickly became the political center of the northern kingdom. Its location allowed Israel's kings to control major roads and watch over the surrounding territory. Under Omri and the rulers who followed him, Israel became a serious regional power. But while the kingdom was growing stronger outwardly, something far more dangerous was happening inside. The spiritual compromise that had begun under Jeroboam was now becoming even deeper. Omri's son, King Ahab, would take the kingdom into one of its darkest periods. Ahab formed a political alliance with the kingdom of Sidon by marrying a princess named Jezebel. In ancient politics, marriages like this were meant to strengthen diplomatic relationships between nations. But this alliance brought something far more destructive into Israel. Jezebel was devoted to the worship of Baal, a powerful pagan god widely worshipped in the surrounding nations. Under her influence, Baal worship began spreading rapidly throughout Israel. Temples dedicated to Baal were built. Altars appeared across the land. Prophets who opposed these practices were hunted down and killed. The kingdom that was meant to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was now filled with competing religions. Yet even during this period of corruption, God did not abandon his people. He raised up prophets to confront the kings and warn the nation. One of the most famous was Elijah, a prophet who stood boldly against Ahab and Jezebel. Elijah challenged the worship of Baal and called the people back to faithfulness. His confrontations with the royal court became legendary, reminding Israel that the God of their ancestors was still watching. But the warnings did not stop with Elijah. Other prophets, such as Hosea and Amos, spoke with increasing urgency. They warned that the nation's corruption was not limited to idolatry. Social injustice was spreading throughout the land. Wealthy leaders were exploiting the poor, judges were accepting bribes, and violence was becoming common. The prophets warned that if Israel continued down this path, disaster would come. But many of the kings ignored these warnings. Instead of turning back to God, the northern kingdom continued drifting further away from the covenant that had once defined its identity. Israel had become stronger politically than ever before, but spiritually, it was slowly heading toward destruction. For generations, the prophets had warned the northern kingdom that its choices would lead to disaster. Again and again, messengers of God called the people to turn away from idols, abandon injustice, and return to the covenant their ancestors had made. But the warnings were ignored. Israel continued building altars to foreign gods. Pagan rituals spread across the hills and towns of the kingdom. Even practices that had once shocked the nation, such as sacrificing children to false gods, began to appear among the people. The prophets spoke with urgency, but the kings and the people refused to listen. Meanwhile, far to the northeast, a powerful empire was rising. The Assyrians were becoming the most feared military force in the ancient world. Their armies moved across the region with terrifying speed, conquering nations and absorbing territories into a vast empire. Eventually, their attention turned toward Israel. The Assyrian army marched into the land and surrounded Samaria, the strong capital city built on its high defensive hill. At first, the city seemed capable of holding out. Its walls were strong, and its position made it difficult to attack. But the Assyrians were patient. For 3 long years, Samaria remained under siege. Supplies slowly disappeared, and the people inside the city began to starve. What had once been a powerful kingdom now struggled simply to survive. Finally, the walls were breached. The northern kingdom of Israel fell in 722 BC. The Assyrians did not simply conquer the land. They dismantled the nation itself. Large portions of the population were taken away and scattered across the Assyrian Empire. Families were relocated to distant regions, separated from their homeland and from each other. Over time, many of these exiled communities lost their identity as Israelites. The 10 tribes that had once formed the northern kingdom gradually disappeared into history. When news of Israel's destruction reached Judah, the southern kingdom must have felt a mixture of shock and fear. A nation that had once been their rival had now been completely erased. But the fall of Israel was more than a political event. It was a warning. The prophets made it clear that Israel's destruction had not happened by accident. It was the result of generations of idolatry, injustice, and refusal to listen to God's warnings. Judah now stood alone. The question was whether the southern kingdom would learn from Israel's fate or follow the same path toward destruction. When we step back and look at the story of Israel and Judah, the conflict between these two kingdoms becomes more than just an ancient political struggle. It becomes a powerful lesson about how division, pride, and spiritual compromise can destroy even the strongest nation. At the height of David and Solomon's reigns, Israel had everything a kingdom could desire. The tribes were united. The nation was wealthy. The temple stood as a symbol of God's presence among His people. Foreign nations respected Israel's power and wisdom. Yet within a few generations, that unity had completely collapsed. The division began with leadership decisions, but it grew deeper because of something far more serious. The people slowly drifted away from the values and faith that had originally united them. Idolatry replaced devotion. Pride replaced humility. Political power became more important than obedience to God. Once the kingdom was divided, the consequences multiplied. Israel and Judah spent decades fighting each other instead of standing together. Their strength was drained through constant conflict. Resources that could have built a stronger nation were spent on war and defense. Meanwhile, powerful empires were rising around them, waiting for the opportunity to conquer weakened kingdoms. The fall of Israel, and later the destruction of Judah, showed how dangerous division can be. The tribes that once marched together under David were eventually scattered across foreign lands. But even in the middle of this tragedy, the biblical story does not end in despair. The prophets continued to speak about hope. They promised that one day God would restore His people, bring unity where there had been division, and raise up a righteous king from the line of David. The story of Israel and Judah reminds us that unity, faithfulness, and wise leadership matter deeply in the life of any nation or community. If this story helped you understand the Bible in a new way, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more biblical stories explained simply. Thank you for watching and exploring this powerful chapter of history with me.
Reflecting on this trip truly moved me. It's a sobering reminder that a nation's greatest threat isn't always a foreign army, but the fractures within its honor hurt. Diving deep into the historical records of Israel and Judah revealed how quickly pride can dismantle a legacy of unity. We spent countless hours researching these ancient texts to ensure every detail captures the weight of this tragedy. If these stories of faith and history resonate with you, please subscribe and join in our community. Your support allows us to keep uncovering these profound truths. Let's continue this journey together. Hit that notification bell and never miss a chapter.